Chapter 8. The Lure of the Intellect and Pride. I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, and he instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to his son. Bhagavad Gita 4:1. Preceding chapters chronicled the Son of God's perfect execution of spiritual discipline, establishing him as the perfect servant by rejecting illusory independence. He then repelled the grossest temptations of the material modes, the hunger of the senses and the ambition of worldly wealth and glory. Having proved immune to the grandeur and majestic show of luxury, the son now faces the most subtle and pervasive trap set by the tempter, the lure of the intellect and the pride of scholarly achievement. This chapter examines the third phase of the trial, rooted in Milton's Paradise Regained, Book 3, where Satan attempts to convince the son that his divine purpose must be actualized through established worldly means, military conquest, political mastery, and human knowledge. The son's triumph in this sphere provides the definitive instruction that liberation requires knowledge received exclusively through an authorized line of teaching, thereby defeating those who would corrupt spiritual wisdom with personal interpretations. The fundamental basis for this truth is affirmed in our chapter motto, establishing the imperative that genuine spiritual science must be transmitted through a pure, unbroken chain of succession, a principle the son upholds against the chaotic schemes of the tempter. My father, during a thoughtful evening walk, once said, "Son, true wisdom flows like a river from its source. Stray from the stream and you're lost in a desert of pride." This chapter, guided by his insight in the Gita's teachings, explores how the son's rejection of intellectual vanity illuminates the path to paradise regained, offering a lesson for today's scholars and seekers. The nature of intellectual pride. Before examining Satan's specific temptations, it's crucial to understand the unique challenge posed by intellectual pride. Unlike the gross temptations of sensual pleasure or material accumulation, intellectual pride presents itself as noble and spiritual. The desire for knowledge appears virtuous, the quest for understanding seems admirable, and the accumulation of learning feels like genuine progress. This subtlety makes intellectual pride particularly dangerous for spiritual seekers. The nature of intellectual pride. Before examining Satan's specific temptations, it's crucial to understand the unique challenge posed by intellectual pride. Unlike the gross temptations of sensual pleasure or material accumulation, intellectual pride presents itself as noble and spiritual. The desire for knowledge appears virtuous, the quest for understanding seems admirable, and the accumulation of learning feels like genuine progress. This subtlety makes intellectual pride particularly dangerous for spiritual seekers. While most people recognize greed and lust as obstacles to spiritual development, fewer understand how the pursuit of knowledge itself can become a trap when motivated by false ego rather than genuine service. The scholar who masters texts to impress others, the teacher who prioritizes appearing wise over helping students, and the seeker who collects spiritual techniques like trophies all demonstrate how noble activities can serve ignoble purposes. Contemporary culture amplifies these challenges through the democratization of information and the proliferation of expert voices across all media. Never before have so many people had access to so much knowledge, yet this abundance often creates confusion rather than clarity. The sheer volume of available information makes discrimination between authentic and inauthentic teachings increasingly difficult, while social media rewards provocative opinions over measured wisdom. Satan begins Book 3 of Paradise Regained by renewing his assault on the son's sense of purpose, arguing that the quickest path to becoming savior to mankind is through establishing political and military dominance. He first attempts to tempt the son with the glory of military empires, such as Parthia and Rome, subtly praising the effectiveness of human effort and conquest, urging him to seize the throne of David by political force. The temptation of unauthorized action. Satan's suggestion that the son should rush the process of redemption by seizing immediate power, gathering a retinue, and exploiting the dizzy multitude, constitutes an appeal to unauthorized or misdirected action. While action done according to spiritual principles leads to purification, action done against divine guidance or outside the divine plan leads only to bondage. In modern terms, this mirrors corporate leaders bypassing ethics for quick success, politicians using divisive rhetoric to gain power, or activists employing harmful methods to advance beneficial causes. The psychological appeal of this temptation lies in its apparent reasonableness. Why shouldn't divine purposes be advanced through effective worldly means? Why not use available power structures to accomplish spiritual goals? The answer reveals a crucial principle: the means inevitably shape the ends. Methods based on force, manipulation, or deception cannot produce genuine spiritual transformation, regardless of the stated intentions. The Son's rejection of this political path is absolute, resting on the conviction that everything must be best fulfilled in their due time, and entrusted to his due time and providence. He understands that he is not meant to be a transient earthly ruler but the upholder of eternal spiritual principles. The greatest spiritual teachers must behave properly even before instructing others, following the principles of Scripture and never attempting to create rules against the principles of revealed teachings. Relevance of divine timing. The Son's insistence on divine timing rather than forced action provides crucial guidance for contemporary spiritual practitioners who live in cultures that emphasize immediate results and rapid progress. Pressure to achieve quick spiritual advancement, demonstrate measurable growth, or produce visible changes in the world can lead practitioners to adopt methods that undermine their deeper purposes. This principle applies across multiple domains. Personal development. The tendency to force spiritual experiences through extreme practices, drug use, or emotional manipulation rather than allowing natural maturation through consistent, balanced practice. Social change. The temptation to use divisive or violent methods to advance beneficial social causes rather than working through patient education, dialogue, and example. Religious leadership. The pressure to grow religious communities through entertainment, emotional manipulation, or compromise of principles rather than authentic teaching and genuine transformation. Educational reform. The desire to improve educational outcomes through standardized testing, competitive pressure, or technological shortcuts rather than supporting teachers and students in authentic learning relationships. The dangers of passion-driven work. Satan's strategy promotes action driven by passion, characterized by great effort by one seeking fruitive results and enacted from a sense of false self-identification. The Son, however, is a perfect servant who acts without attachment to the result of his work. He is convinced that the empires of the world, like Rome, are merely products of passionate corruption, governing nations under yoke, and exhausting provinces by lust and rapine. By rejecting the opportunity for worldly conquest, the Son fulfills his spiritual responsibility. The instruction states that it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though they may be faulty, than another's duties. The Son's duty is redemption through perfect obedience, not ruling through material might. He demonstrates that a person in spiritual consciousness can participate in any action, even challenging tasks, without being disturbed by material dualities, provided it is done for divine satisfaction, a principle reflected in peacemakers who reject violence even when it might produce faster results. This teaching addresses a common confusion among spiritually minded people about engagement with worldly affairs. Some conclude that spiritual life requires complete withdrawal from political, social, or economic activities. Others believe that spiritual principles require aggressive activism to reform society. The Son's example suggests a middle path. Engage fully in appropriate activities while maintaining inner detachment from results and refusing to compromise spiritual principles for expedient outcomes. Having failed to tempt the Son with power over the body and the material realm, Satan makes his final, most subtle appeal to the mind. He presents the intellectual glory of the Western canon, urging the Son to study sage philosophy, including the streams of the academics, peripatetics, and Stoics. Satan implies that true mastery of divine purpose requires absorbing human wisdom, a trap that elevates the intellect over divine revelation. The illusion of self-derived knowledge. This temptation targets the pride of intellectual achievement, a pitfall the Gita warns against. People of small knowledge are very much attached to the flowery words which recommend various fruitive activities for elevation to heavenly planets. Such vain philosophy or speculative knowledge is likened to sacrificing wisdom that leads to confusion rather than liberation. In today's context, this mirrors academics debating theories without spiritual grounding, producing endless papers with little practical impact on human well-being. The contemporary academic environment particularly exemplifies this trap. Universities reward publication over wisdom, theoretical innovation over practical application, and specialized knowledge over integrated understanding. Professors who never leave their libraries may know more facts about spiritual traditions than practicing devotees, yet lack the experiential understanding that comes through actual spiritual discipline. This pattern extends beyond formal academia into popular culture, where spiritual concepts become topics for intellectual discussion rather than practical transformation. The people collect spiritual ideas like souvenirs, enjoying the sense of sophistication that comes from familiarity with diverse traditions while avoiding the actual work of implementing any particular path consistently. Intellectual seduction. The son's response is rooted in his reliance on divine guidance. Think not but that I know these things, or have not read the authors thou hast named. Yet he asserts that such learning is but to know that which before us lies in daily life. He understands that true wisdom transcends academic pursuits, aligning with the Gita's teaching that divine wisdom is maintainable by surrender rather than intellectual effort alone. My father once said, "Books are tools, not masters, divine truth is the guide." This rejection of vain philosophy sets the stage for understanding the superiority of authorized knowledge over speculative thinking. The son's response reveals several crucial principles. Practical wisdom. True knowledge should enhance rather than complicate daily life. Spiritual understanding that cannot be applied to ordinary circumstances remains merely theoretical. Integrated learning. The highest wisdom synthesizes rather than fragments understanding. Academic specialization, while useful for specific purposes, should not replace the integrated vision that sees underlying unity. Experiential validation. Intellectual understanding gains value when confirmed through direct experience. Ideas that sound impressive but produce no transformation in consciousness or behavior reveal their limitations. Service orientation. Knowledge pursued for personal aggrandizement serves different purposes than knowledge sought to benefit others. The motivation behind learning significantly affects its spiritual value. The definitive instruction delivered through this confrontation is that true knowledge must be derived from an authorized source, because it is difficult to understand without proper guidance. This principle addresses one of the most crucial challenges facing contemporary spiritual seekers: how to distinguish authentic teaching from the countless variations, interpretations, and innovations that flood the spiritual marketplace. The eternal chain of instruction. The chapter motto details how the divine originally imparted the imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, who instructed Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu instructed his son. This science was especially meant for saintly rulers because they were responsible for executing its purpose in guiding the citizens. Text reveals that this succession was broken in the course of time, and authentic knowledge became scattered by the motives of those who introduced personal interpretations. To follow the path of liberation, one must follow the example of Arjuna, who accepted the divine as the supreme reality. Anyone who follows in Arjuna's footsteps is certainly not bewildered. This chain of teaching or disciplic succession ensures the purity of knowledge, as my father explained. It's like a family recipe. Passed down unchanged, it retains its authentic flavor. In modern times, this parallels trusted mentorship programs that preserve authentic skills and knowledge. The principle of authorized transmission reflects deep understanding of how spiritual knowledge actually functions. Unlike academic information, which can be conveyed through books and lectures alone, spiritual wisdom requires the living example and personal guidance of someone who has integrated the teachings into their own consciousness and behavior. This transmission occurs on multiple levels. Intellectual understanding. The concepts and practices must be clearly explained and correctly understood. Emotional integration. The student must develop the proper attitudes and motivations that support spiritual development rather than ego gratification. Practical application. The teachings must be implemented in daily life through consistent practice under qualified guidance. Character transformation. The ultimate goal is transformation of character and consciousness, not merely accumulation of spiritual knowledge. Living example. Students learn as much from observing their teacher's character and behavior as from formal instruction. traditional spiritual communities developed elaborate systems to preserve authentic transmission across generations. These included requirements for students to demonstrate character development before receiving advanced teachings, extended periods of service to test motivation, and careful selection of qualified successors to maintain teaching lineages. Challenges to authentic transmission. Modern culture poses unique challenges to traditional transmission methods. Democratization of information. Anyone can now publish books, create videos, or establish online communities teaching spiritual practices, regardless of their qualifications or level of realization. Consumer mentality. Students often approach spiritual teaching as consumers shopping for products rather than disciples seeking transformation, leading to superficial engagement with multiple traditions simultaneously. Institutional breakdown. Traditional structures that supported long-term student-teacher relationships have weakened, leaving many seekers without sustained guidance through the challenges of spiritual development. Cultural translation. Ancient teachings developed in specific cultural contexts must be adapted for contemporary circumstances without losing their essential meaning. Authority issues. Modern individualism creates resistance to the humility and surrender traditionally required for authentic spiritual learning. The archetypal misleading teacher. Satan, having failed in direct conflict, operates as the definitive artificer of fraud. His function is to mislead mankind by corrupting the divine message. Milton explicitly states that Satan's deception works because people fell idolatrous, giving way to his delusions. Satan's efforts to divert the sun are identical to those of speculative teachers who have very little knowledge of divine truth and who try to banish or reinterpret authentic teachings when writing commentary. Such unauthorized interpretation is misleading and dangerous. Great spiritual teachers have warned that understanding authentic scriptures from speculative viewpoints will commit a great error, causing students to be confused on the path of spiritual guidance. The Son's understanding, derived from perfect faith, stands in stark contrast to those who are self-complacent and perform practices in name only without following any rules, as seen in today's self-proclaimed spiritual authorities. Characteristics of misleading teaching. Satan's approach reveals patterns that characterize inauthentic spiritual teaching. Appeal to pride. Misleading teachers flatter students' egos rather than encouraging the humility necessary for genuine spiritual development. Promise of shortcuts. They offer quick results or easy methods that bypass the sustained effort traditionally required for spiritual maturation. Intellectual complexity. They emphasize sophisticated theories and complex philosophies that impress the mind but don't necessarily transform character. Independence from authority. They encourage students to reject traditional guidance in favor of personal interpretation and individual spiritual discovery. Focus on technique. They emphasize methods and practices while neglecting the character development and surrender that make techniques effective. Commercial motivation. They treat spiritual teaching as a business opportunity rather than sacred service. Recognizing authentic guidance. In contrast, authentic spiritual guidance typically demonstrates certain characteristics. Emphasis on character. Genuine teachers prioritize students' character development over impressive spiritual experiences or sophisticated understanding. Connection to tradition. They maintain clear connections to established lineages while adapting teachings appropriately for contemporary circumstances. Personal example. Their own lives demonstrate the fruits of the teachings they share, showing integration of spiritual principles into daily behavior. Service orientation. They clearly prioritize students' spiritual welfare over personal gain, recognition, or institutional advancement. Balanced approach. They maintain balance between compassion and discipline, neither enabling students' weaknesses nor crushing their confidence. Long-term commitment. They maintain relationships with students over extended periods, supporting them through the ups and downs of spiritual development. The Son's triumphant answer to Satan's philosophical challenge is to assert the ultimate, inexhaustible power of transcendental truth. He understands that knowledge of divine will is the only thing capable of overcoming the darkness born of ignorance. The highest perfection of knowledge. The knowledge the Son possesses is described as transcendental understanding, the basis of recognizing the self as the eternal servant of the divine, far superior to all other processes of knowledge. The wise person, being in factual knowledge, must not agitate those confused by material identification. The son acts wisely, simply stating the truth and refusing to engage in further useless debate that would only validate Satan's speculative agenda, a stance relevant to modern debates where humility and clarity serve better than intellectual combat. This approach reflects mature spiritual understanding that recognizes the limitations of argumentation in producing genuine conviction. While logical reasoning has its place in spiritual development, ultimate realization comes through direct experience rather than intellectual persuasion. The son's example shows that authentic spiritual authority manifests through example and presence rather than rhetorical skill. Knowledge and devotion. The son's wisdom lies in his ability to discriminate between actions that serve divine purposes and those that merely satisfy personal ambition. This intelligence, classified as understanding in the mode of goodness, allows him to correctly identify what leads to liberation and what creates further bondage. He is fixed in the knowledge that he is a part of the Supreme, and therefore his role is not his by choice but is chosen for him by the Supreme and is done only through divine agency. My father likened this to a script. We're actors, not directors. Follow the author's lines. This metaphor illustrates the relationship between individual will and divine purpose. Like skilled actors who find creative expression within their assigned roles rather than rewriting the play, mature spiritual practitioners discover freedom through conscious cooperation with divine will rather than assertion of personal preferences. This integration of knowledge and devotion addresses a common split in spiritual communities between those who emphasize understanding and those who prioritize devotional practices. The son's example shows that the highest spiritual development requires both intellectual clarity about our relationship with the divine and emotional surrender to that relationship. The end of philosophical doubt. By the close of this chapter, the son has neutralized Satan's power over the material, political, and intellectual domains. His reliance on divine direction ensures that his activities are always auspicious, free from the reactions of pious or impious actions, a state called renunciation. He remains fixed in the knowledge that he is the soul and the divine is the controller. The son's absolute reliance on divine will, receiving and executing the instructions of the living oracle, achieves the perfection of spiritual understanding. Having attained this transcendental state, the son is now positioned for the final, most direct confrontation concerning the nature of his very identity. He has cut off all philosophical doubt and speculation, ensuring that the path to paradise regained is firmly illuminated by pure knowledge. The son's example provides crucial guidance for contemporary spiritual seekers who must navigate unprecedented access to information while distinguishing authentic wisdom from sophisticated speculation. Developing spiritual discrimination. The ability to distinguish authentic spiritual teaching from imitation requires developing what traditional texts call spiritual discrimination. This faculty emerges through character assessment, observing whether teachers demonstrate the virtues they advocate, particularly humility, compassion, and selfless service. Fruit evaluation, examining whether engagement with particular teachings produces genuine transformation in consciousness and behavior, or merely intellectual satisfaction. Traditional consistency, comparing contemporary presentations with established scriptural authorities to identify significant departures or innovations. Community health, observing whether spiritual communities demonstrate mutual respect, genuine care for members' welfare, and balanced psychological development. Long-term sustainability, assessing whether spiritual practices and teachings support sustainable life patterns rather than requiring constant intensity or producing periodic burnout. Avoiding spiritual materialism. Term spiritual materialism describes the tendency to collect spiritual experiences, teachings, and practices as possessions that enhance self-image rather than tools for genuine transformation. The son's rejection of intellectual pride provides guidance for avoiding this trap. Consistency over novelty. Rather than constantly seeking new techniques or teachings, practitioners benefit from sustained engagement with established practices under qualified guidance. Application over accumulation. Emphasizing practical implementation of basic principles serves spiritual development better than theoretical mastery of complex concepts. Service over achievement. Focusing on how spiritual development enables better service to others prevents practice from becoming self-centered. Community over isolation. Engaging with other sincere practitioners provides accountability and support while preventing the inflation that comes from practicing alone. Humility over expertise. Maintaining beginner's mind regardless of experience level keeps practitioners open to continued learning and growth. The sun's example demonstrates that authentic spiritual development integrates rather than opposes intellectual understanding and devotional surrender. This integration addresses a false dichotomy that appears in many spiritual communities between head and heart approaches to spiritual life. Intellectual devotion. True spiritual intelligence serves devotional purposes rather than ego gratification. This includes study as worship, approaching sacred texts with reverence and gratitude rather than critical analysis designed to find flaws or demonstrate superiority. Teaching as service, sharing spiritual knowledge to benefit others rather than to establish personal authority or expertise. Learning as humility, recognizing that deeper understanding reveals the vastness of what remains unknown rather than providing grounds for pride. Reasoning as prayer, using logical thinking to understand divine purposes rather than to justify personal preferences or avoid spiritual discipline. Devotional intelligence. Similarly, authentic devotion employs rather than abandons intellectual faculties. Discriminating love, distinguishing between genuine spiritual emotion and sentimental attachment that may impede spiritual progress. Intelligent surrender, understanding what to surrender and how to surrender rather than abandoning all discrimination and responsibility. Practical wisdom, applying spiritual principles skillfully in daily circumstances rather than retreating into emotional states that avoid worldly engagement. Balanced development, cultivating all aspects of human nature, intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual, in service of divine purposes. Transcendental wisdom. The sun's victory over the lure of the intellect and pride establishes the final pillar for paradise regained, liberation through knowledge received in pure succession, free from the distortions of human pride. By rejecting unauthorized action, vain philosophy, and intellectual vanity, the sun demonstrates that true wisdom lies in surrender to divine authority rather than assertion of personal understanding. My father often said, "Pride blinds, but humility sees the light." This wisdom encapsulates the essential lesson of this chapter, that spiritual development requires the courage to acknowledge our limitations and seek guidance from sources greater than our individual intelligence. The sun's triumph over the subtlest temptation prepares him for the ultimate test of his identity. His journey, marked by obedience, self-control, and now transcendental wisdom, assures his ascent to the supreme destination while offering a beacon for all seeking liberation from the illusions of the mind. For contemporary practitioners, the sun's example provides practical guidance for maintaining spiritual focus amid the information overload and intellectual chaos that characterize modern culture. By prioritizing authentic transmission over novel interpretation, practical application over theoretical accumulation, and service over self-aggrandizement, sincere seekers can navigate the complexities of spiritual development while avoiding the subtle traps of intellectual pride. Path to paradise regained requires not the abandonment of intelligence but its consecration to divine service. When intellectual faculties serve rather than compete with spiritual surrender, they become powerful instruments for both personal transformation and service to others. This integration of wisdom and devotion, demonstrated perfectly by the sun, remains the golden standard for all authentic spiritual development.